All right, welcome to the Study Principles lecture in the Crushing the Preclinical Years free How to Study course. So the first thing we'll go over here is kind of the general thought, right? So this lecture is laid out in such a way that we talk about kind of how you study and how I studied and kind of the three areas of focus on studying. So the general thought to studying is the more the better, right? This is kind of one of those old adages that the more you see it, the more you review it, the better you know it. And this is so true. It really is a matter of how many times you review something. The more you review it, the better you know it. And this all comes from this 10,000 hour idea, right? There's a saying out there, a thought out there that if you spend 10,000 hours doing a particular thing, then you become a professional at it. And that is so true. If you do the same thing over and over again for 10,000 hours, you become a professional. And same thing in medical school. If you study the same lecture, not 10,000 times, that would be ridiculous. But if you study the same lecture or the same topic, 10, 15 times in a row, and then you do some practice questions on it, you're going to be pretty well set on that topic and how it works. So we'll really go into detail about my method that I use to get a 4.0 and to score above the 90th percentile on my board exams in this lecture. So we'll talk about my lecture tracker, we'll talk about how I check them off, and we'll talk about how I used Anki, Anki, whatever you want to call it. I was not really big into using Anki. I didn't jive well with it. I'm not a flashcard kind of person, but at the end of the day, I did use it, and I'll tell you kind of how I used it with my lectures. So I used a lecture tracker, which is a fancy way of saying I wrote every single lecture down on a piece of paper for every block exam. So when we'd have a block exam, every time we got a new lecture, I'd write it down on a piece of paper. So every single day I'd have 3 or 4 new lectures or whatever, however many classes I attended or watched online. And each one of those lectures, I would write the title of that lecture down on this piece of paper. And then as I went and studied them from the get-go, right, from day one. So the lecture on Monday, 2 weeks before the block exam, was on cell biology, on receptors. Then I would write down receptors, cell biology. And every single time I went over that lecture after the professor gave the lecture, I'd put a check there. And my goal was usually to have somewhere between 5 to 10 checks on every single lecture. And if I knew that if I had 5 to 10 checks on every single lecture on that piece of paper, the Sunday before the block exam, because our block exams were Monday, if I had 5 to 10 checks on every single lecture, that I knew that I had reviewed that material sufficiently, and I felt pretty good about it. So that was a good way for me to do it. And then for Anki, the way I added that in, since I didn't really like studying off it didn't fit my style, I used it as a kind of quiz form. So that Saturday, Sunday before the test, I would basically take Anki, somebody else made them, and I would take their decks, and I would go through, and I'd essentially, if I could answer all the questions that somebody else made, and kind of go through it that fashion, then I knew I was ready for the test, right? So I knew I was ready for the test if I had 5 to 10 checks on every single lecture. I felt comfortable as I went through the lecture. I knew what the topic was about on every slide. And then using the Anki, I would go through and basically quiz myself. And if I did okay on those quizzes, then I felt good. And that was essentially my general method. I know it's super advanced and super involved, but that worked pretty well for me. So there's 3 areas of studying that we'll cover in this. We'll talk in detail about lectures, boards, and then real doctoring. We'll break each one down. This is likely the most important one for medical school, and then this is likely the most important one for kind of lifetime for your career. And there's some different material in each one, and there's some importance in each, and there's not some importance in each. So let's get into them. So for lectures. Lectures are important. They are the foundation of all of your medical knowledge. Most schools, 70% of what's in lectures is what's going to be on boards, and they're very important. And then there's a decent percentage that won't be on boards, and it's not important. And then, there's some that it's really just for your career as a doctor. I remember in medical school, I had like I think it was 105 PowerPoint slide presentation from one of the professors on fibromyalgia, right? You don't need to know There's not enough to talk about that for 105 slides. And some of it was just copied and pasted from texts. And so, there was a lot of non-important information in there, but then there were some other lectures. For example, my OB-GYN lectures that were to the point. There was maybe 10, 15 slides each lecture, and they were all super high yield for boards and for your career. And so, there's a huge variation in terms of what is presented in those lectures, and if it's clinically important, if it's board relevant, and sometimes it's honestly just material for a block exam. Um, so, but all that being said, you still got to study them. You still have to pass your lectures. If you don't pass your classes, you don't take boards, you don't become a doctor, okay? So you still have to study no matter how clinically relevant or how board relevant the material is. So that's where the importance factor comes into play. Lectures, as annoying as it can be when they're just not super useful, you still have to study for them. You still have to pass them. And the better you do in lectures, most med school curriculums, the better you do in lectures, the better you'll do on boards. Better you do on lectures and boards, likely the better doctor you're going to be, right? That's not a direct correlation, but it's true, right? If you have a bigger base of knowledge, you're going to know more as a doctor. You're going to know when there's issues and whatnot. So we already kind of talked about my tracker that I used. Guys, it was literally just a piece of paper with every single lecture written down on it. And like I said, when I'd go to the lecture, I would write it down on my piece of paper after I watched that lecture. So at home, I didn't go to lectures. I watched them all online. And so, if I watched 4 or 5 lectures that day, after I got done watching them, I'd write them on my piece of paper. And that was how I knew kind of what to study and the lectures that were important. And so I didn't forget any lectures. And then the schedule for studying lectures. It worked out pretty well for me that I would watch them online. I'm not a go-to-class kind of person. I'm more of a watch them online. And so I would watch them all online in the afternoon at like 2 times speed. And basically I would go over each lecture multiple times a day. So throughout the day I would wake up early in the morning. I would hit some board review questions. This is like second year. Hit some board review questions. In first year, I'd highly recommend first thing you do, if you're following the same schedule as me, which is kind of lectures in the afternoon since I watched them online. In the morning, I'd highly recommend that you do some board review material. And then, between 8 to noonish, go through the lectures from the day before. So that was my focus. I always got up pretty early. So between like 4 a.m. and 7 a.m., I would do some board review material if you're in first year. Between 4 and 7, I would do some board review questions if you're in second year. Then between like 8 to noon, if you have nothing else going on in terms of labs or whatnot, and you're able to stay home and watch your lectures, I would highly recommend you go over the lectures from the day before. And that's the time where I would use my tracker and go down what lectures we had the day before or a few days before, and I'd check them off as I study each one. So I go through the entire lecture and check it off when I'm done going through it. And then early afternoon, after lunch between 1 to 3, if lectures were uploaded to our site, I would go on and watch our lectures. And then after I get done watching our lectures online, I would write them down on my tracker. And then basically, in the afternoon, it's kind of a free-for-all. I would study whatever lectures I felt like I needed to up until dinner. And then after dinner, kind of same story. I would use board review resources to go through the topics that I basically kind of went through that day. So if we're studying cell biology, cell receptors, then I would bust out Boards and Beyond in the evening, and I would go through cell biology, cell receptors. That's basically how I did it, guys. I pulled those board review resources in and used them alongside lectures. So just to review kind of my typical schedule. Okay, so between 4 to 7 a.m. in the morning, if I'm in first year, I would highly recommend that you use board review resources. You bust out Boards and Beyond. You take out sketchy pharmacology or sketchy micro, those kinds of things. And you go through those things. You become very familiar with them, and you go through the topics that you're studying in class. So once again, cell receptors and cell biology. If you're studying that in your first year course, then be sure to watch that section in Boards and Beyond. And likewise for everything else, whatever you're studying, be sure to watch that section in those board review resources. So that's between 4 to 7 a.m. And then between 8 to noon, if you don't have any labs or anything, don't have anywhere to be at school, and you can watch it from home like I did, that would be the time to review material from the day before. Now, if you go to lectures and your lectures are from 8 to noon, that'd be the time to go to lecture. And then, in the afternoon, you review the stuff from the day before. Instead of what I did in the afternoon between 12 to 3, I would watch lectures from that day. And so you can just kind of flip-flop those two things. And then I usually took a break between 3 and 4, went walking with my wife and dog, exercised, lifted weights, something. And then between like 4 to 6 until we had dinner, I would focus pretty hard on any lectures that were giving me issues. So if I knew there was a lecture that was more difficult, something I didn't get to, something that was longer, I'd study that in that time frame. And then in the late evening between 7 to 9, I would hit some board review resources and kind of go over those same topics, right? So if I'm studying murmurs in class, then that evening I'm watching murmurs on Boards and Beyond. I'm watching cardiac pathology and pathoma. Or during that time, if I feel like I needed to hit some more lectures, I'd do more lectures. So really, it's fairly simple in terms of what my schedule was, and it's pretty easy to flip-flop it if you go to class and still watch them online. So boards. Oh my gosh, boards are so important. Class versus boards. There's a lot of information in class that's not on boards, and so really, if you can focus on boards from very early on, that is extremely important, because class is great and class is nice and it builds the foundation, but board scores are really what most people pay attention to, and this is what you have to know as a doctor. So I like to start early. And I like to do questions starting in second year. So I wouldn't waste your time in doing any practice questions in first year. I think that it's kind of doesn't really help you a whole lot because your foundation isn't very big. But in second year, start doing questions every day. In first year, use your review resources, right? We talked on the last slide about Pathoma, Boards and Beyond, that kind of stuff. Use that alongside your classes. And that comes to this next point of you need to focus on boards but don't neglect class. And the way that you do this is by watching the same videos in Boards and Beyond or Pathoma that you're studying in class. So if you are on, let's say, cardiac pathology or pneumonia, right, pulmonary pathology. If you're studying that in class, then go and watch that section in Boards and Beyond. Go and watch that section in Pathoma. That's the best way to kind of utilize these board review resources early on, and to start studying what isn't is I'm sorry, what is actually important for boards. If you study what's actually important for boards early on, then you're going to be so much more familiar with those resources. You're going to be so much more ready for boards than all your classmates that have just been studying for class. So kind of integrating them together and using those board review resources as a resource during classes is a great idea. So what I did daily questions starting in second year. So I would start with something like Conquest, Amboss, one of those question banks, and I would do that daily, right? I would do questions daily starting in second year. The very first day of second year, I'd start doing 15 questions a day, and I would review those questions in detail. I would go through that in depth. I would treat each question like it was a test question. I would do them in tutor mode. So I'd do the question, then I'd review it pretty hard. And what I did when I was doing this is I'd pull out my first aid. And I would do the question. I would treat the question like a real question, read the question explanation after I get it right or wrong, doesn't matter. And then I'd go through that page in first aid. So if it was on pharmacology, on antibiotics, then I would go to that page in first aid after I do the question, after I read the question explanation, and then I would annotate the question explanation into that page in first aid, so that I am now pulling this information from these question banks and putting it into first aid, because first aid is fantastic, but first aid is very, very sparse, and it's very bulleted type information, and it's for good reason. We'll cover all that when we get into the resources. But anyways, starting second year, I would do daily questions, like 15 questions a day, and I would really, really focus on understanding what was being talked about. And then we've talked multiple times already about how I used review resources. If I could do it all over again, I would get Boards and Beyond from day one of medical school, and I would go through that alongside classes. I'm not saying that you have to start studying for boards from day one. What I'm saying is using these review resources really helps you understand what the important information is from class. Because, a lot of classes will kind of interject a lot of information that is not necessarily useful to your career or to boards. It's kind of interesting, maybe it's the professor's research they're doing or something, and it's interesting, but it's not important for your life, right? And so using these review resources early on, if you could handle doing that, day one of med school, busting out boards and beyond and reviewing it, that would be so helpful. And so I would use review resources just alongside classes, and whatever I'm studying in class, I'd bust that out and do it, watch those videos alongside my studying. So as far as the schedule for boards goes, in first year, God, with those review resources, I stopped using them the Wednesday before block exams. So we always had our block exams on a Monday. So that would be 5 days before the block exam. I would stop looking at any review resources because at that point in time, I need to make sure I pass my block exams. Because if I don't pass my block exams, I don't pass the class, I don't become a doctor. So the Wednesday before, no matter how ridiculous some of the details are in lectures, I made sure to learn them because I needed to pass those classes. And so the Wednesday before block exams, I would stop using any board review resources, and at that point in time, it became only about the lectures. So I'd go back to my tracker, and I would become obsessed with just putting check marks next to those lectures. And I would go through and I'd review those lectures like crazy. And the only focus for those 5 days was on the lectures and what was going to be on the tests. So that's what I did. Worked really well for me, and I feel like 5 days before, having a dedicated weekend just to the lectures for the class really helped solidify some of that material, and it kind of gave me this like 5-day blitz of information that was going to be on that test, and I think that made a big difference for me when it came time to test day. So real doctoring is the last area of study. As we've mentioned a few times, there's so much on boards and in class that just doesn't really help with this kind of stuff. And there's also a lot of it that will help you. It's kind of hit or miss. There's 60% of it is great. It'll help you a ton, and maybe 40% of it, you could probably do without. But you'll learn, right? The first 2 years of medical school are really building this foundation for you to go out and learn how to be a real doctor. So the first 2 years, you're not learning how to be a real doctor. You're learning the foundation of information. Clinical rotations will start to help you understand how to be a real doctor. You'll start to understand what you need to know. You'll get the chance to kind of learn the things that you don't and see what you need to know from being in the real world. And then residency is the pinnacle of where you will learn how to be a real doctor. Intern year, that is a tough year, and you will learn so much that year. You will learn what's important, what's not important. And so, the real doctoring aspect kind of comes secondary to prepping for boards and whatnot in medical school, because medical school is building the foundation, and medical school is getting you ready for boards, right? Because boards are what lets you get to residency, and you need that foundation, and you need those boards to get into residency. And then in residency, after you've built that foundation, that's where the doctoring happens. That's where you really learn what you need to know, and that's where you start to get a sense of what you're good at, what you're not good at. Like I'm not very great at pulmonary pathology, and so that's something that I continually read during residency. But cardiac pathology I'm great at. I understand how to treat an MI. I know what's going on there. And so I don't worry about that quite as much. And so don't worry a whole lot about this in med school. Just build your foundation, get ready for boards. On clinical rotations, find out what you enjoy and continue to build that foundation. Residency is where you will learn how to become a real doctor. So that's it for this lecture. I hope it's helpful. It's a ton of information. Sorry it's like 20 minutes long, but it is a ton of information. And just remember, start early and study often with your board review resources in med school. If you can handle it from day one of med school, I would get yourself a Boards and Beyond subscription, and I would be going through that alongside your classes. So I hope this has been helpful. We'll see you in the next lecture.